Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to be about the Sedition Act passed during World War I. We're going to take a quick look at it and talk about its legality and its constitutionality and how it's going to impact America during the war. So America was very worried about possible anti-war sentiment brewing in the country. The war was not exactly very popular when the United States decided to join the war. And leading up to the start of the war, we did have some mixed feelings about who we should be supporting and who we should not be supporting. America was home to a very, very large immigrant population from Germany, from Austria, from Italy, from England, and from many of the places that were currently fighting over in the Great War. So in June of 1917, Congress passes the Espionage Act. This act was to target anybody who was undermining the war efforts or working against the United States could face a fine of up to $10,000 and a 20-year prison sentence. President Wilson said, "Millions of men and women of German birth and native sympathy who live amongst us, if there should be disloyalty, it will be dealt with a firm hand of repression." Wilson was very afraid that our large immigrant population would side with their native countries and work to fight against the United States. In May of 1918, things got a bit worse with the passage of the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act made it illegal to speak negatively about the government, to use, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about anything concerning the country, the Constitution, the President, the Army, the war itself. So this is a very strong attack on American civil liberties, our very First Amendment freedom of speech, and the right to petition our government. And during the war, 2,000 people were prosecuted under these two laws. Wilson said publicly that disloyalty to the war effort must be crushed out, and that disloyal individuals had sacrificed their right to civil liberties like free speech and expression. So for the president, controlling speech was a priority, and saying a phrase like must be crushed out and that people have sacrificed their liberties really gives you an indication of how strongly Wilson felt about this. Section 3 of the Espionage Act targeted individuals who willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military. As America institutes the draft in World War I, there were quite a few people who were not happy with that process, and this part of the Espionage Act would target people going after the American men and trying to convince them that the draft was not something they should support or participate in. And there were protests in Washington, D.C. and in other places around the country. We have some protesters out here in front of the White House saying, "Mr. President, remember the Constitution." And then they quote the First Amendment. The political prisoners who believed in this guarantee are now serving 20 years in prison. So along with the suffragettes who famously protested the White House during World War I, we have other people out here, women too, who are protesting the Sedition Act. Mr. President, there can be no real Thanksgiving for American citizens who are in jail for their belief in free speech. So we have a Thanksgiving Day protest out in front of the White House. Let's look at probably one of the most famous cases of this Espionage Act and Sedition Act, specifically from the war. This is Charles Schenck, the General Secretary of the U.S. Socialist Party of Philadelphia. So he's already on the list of things the government is not really happy about. He is a socialist. He's actively involved in the Socialist Party in the United States of America, which, as we've learned in previous lessons, is extremely unpopular and definitely in the minority. Now, he opposed the war as well as the draft. He argued against the Selective Service Act and the draft that it created, citing the 13th Amendment as evidence that the government can't do this. Schenck said, quote, "A conscripted citizen is forced to surrender his right as a citizen and become a subject." So to him, the draft was essentially the enslavement of American men. In his protest of the draft, he distributed about 15,000 anti-draft pamphlets in the city of Philadelphia. He was arrested, tried, and found guilty on 3 counts of violating the Espionage Act. Eventually, Schenck's case makes it up to the Supreme Court, And now the court gets to decide if this Sedition Act is constitutional or not, or if it is in violation of our First Amendment rights. In March of 1919, the Supreme Court unanimously decided that the Espionage Act was in fact constitutional, and that Schenck was guilty. And this might come as a surprise to you, but Justice Holmes provides a lot of explanation here that we really should sort through and try to understand. This is an issue of free speech, and it's probably very important that we understand the court's perspective on this. He said, they, Congress, set up the First Amendment to the Constitution forbidding Congress to make any law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, and bringing the case here on that ground, have argued some other points also of which we must dispose. We admit that in many places and in ordinary times, the defendants, in saying all that was said in the circular, would have been within their constitutional rights. There are some key phrases in there. He says, in many places and in ordinary times. And that really becomes the key language of that quote to explain the court's ruling. That the protection of free speech is not unlimited. The protection of free speech depends on the time and the circumstances of the speech. And depending on the time and the circumstances of the speech, your speech can be limited. It is not absolute. It is not all encompassing, right? There are times when speech is controllable and limited. Holmes went on to say, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. Now, this is the classic explanation of the idea that speech can present a clear and present danger. Depending on the situation, depending on the location, depending on the context of the words, your speech can be dangerous. And if your speech is dangerous, then it should be limited. Causing a panic in a crowded theater is absolutely dangerous. And if that injury or worse were to have occurred because you shouted fire, then maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you shouldn't be able to do that. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right. That if there is a strong anti-war movement or sentiment in America, those words or those phrases or those pamphlets or whatever it is could be undermining America's ability to win the war and putting people in jeopardy, putting the nation in jeopardy. So, in terms of the Sedition Act, it is going to be upheld by the Supreme Court numerous times. One of the other more famous cases that comes up during World War I is the case of Eugene V. Debs, a socialist like Schenck. Debs was probably the most well-known socialist in America and was arrested after giving a speech in Canton, Ohio, speaking out against the draft. In September of 1918, he was sentenced to 10 years for violation of the Sedition Act. The Supreme Court also heard his case, and his conviction was upheld. Eventually, after serving about 5 years in December of 1921, the new president, President Harding, commuted Debs' sentence to the time that he had already served. Political cartoons are a great way to look at attitudes and opinions of controversial issues back in the past. We have one here titled, Must Liberty's Light Go Out, right? So we're talking about the Statue of Liberty. She's our symbol here. She symbolizes liberty and freedom in our country. In her hand is the torch, right? And on the torch it says the word enlightenment, which is being snatched out of her hand by the espionage bill, by the government, this sort of shadowy, cloaked in darkness figure in the background who's snatching enlightenment and freedom and free speech from the Statue of Liberty, that this law is extinguishing liberty's light and the enlightenment that it brings. In this cartoon, we can see Liberty again as the central figure in the cartoon, being driven from the steps of Congress, by Congress itself. You can see the word Congress there. And on the whip, we have the espionage bill right there. That through this espionage bill, we are literally whipping Liberty out of the Capitol building, out of Congress. Liberty, again, who has had her torch extinguished. That torch that's supposed to bring light and enlightenment and freedom to everybody has been doused by the sedition bill. Here we have a serpent, also labeled as the Sedition Bills, and the serpent is about to swallow these three characters here, standing there trying to defend themselves. We have free speech, we have free press, and we have honest opinion. Those characters about to be devoured by the Sedition Bills. So it is silencing the press and silencing our speech and silencing honest opinion. And then this cartoon kind of presents the duality of President Wilson during the war. On the one hand, he speaks of humanity and liberty and the light and its flowers and bunnies, while on the other is a darker side to the president. Okay, so we have his good side and we have his bad side. Let's identify some key takeaways from this look at America during the war. In 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act, whose purpose was to punish individuals who were undermining the war effort, either through their actions or through their speech. In 1918, Congress passes the Sedition Act to silence anti-war speech. The Supreme Court upheld the Sedition Act and rules that speech can actually be limited during a time of war, and that Congress repeals the Sedition Act in late 1920, and then in early 1921, President Wilson provided clemency to most people who were found guilty of violating the law. So, there you have it. Thanks for watching this video lesson, and I hope you learned something.